Welcome to K-Drama for Sleep, where your favourite K-dramas turn into soft, soothing stories to drift off to. Imagine a king surrounded by enemies, where even the palace walls cannot be trusted. To stay alive, he makes a desperate choice, placing a clown who looks exactly like him on the throne, a powerless performer, a hidden king, and a court filled with danger become entangled in a fragile illusion, where one mistake could mean death. But as the man pretending to be king begins to rule with unexpected kindness, the palace starts to change, and so do the people around him. And the most dangerous part, the more real his role becomes, the harder it is to step away from it. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe so you can fall asleep to more of your favourite K-drama stories. So, get comfortable, relax your mind, and let the story gently carry you into sleep. The story begins in a dim royal bedchamber, where a dying king was struggling to say the last words of his life. His younger son, a small boy named Yul, wept beside him. His older son, the Crown Prince Yi-heon, stood a short distance away, staring at the royal robes draped nearby as though they were a living thing he could not quite bring himself to touch. When the king called him closer, there was no tenderness in the summons. The old man looked up at his heir with exhaustion and something sharper underneath, resentment, maybe even dread. He told Yi-heon that knowing this boy would inherit the throne filled him with rage, and that he feared his eldest would turn on little Yul out of spite for the father who had never loved him. He asked Yi-heon, with his last breath, to protect his brother. Yi-heon did not promise. Instead, in a voice so low it barely disturbed the air, he said that if his father wanted a favour, he should beg for it in tears, until his palms wore thin. The old king, trembling with fury, pulled himself upright to meet his son's eyes, and swore he would watch from beyond to see what kind of ruler this insolent boy became. Then his strength gave out, and he collapsed into Yi-heon's arms. For a long moment, the young prince held the body of the father who had despised him, and then, quietly, the tears he had been refusing to shed began to fall. Little Yul came running, weeping, and reached for his brother's hand. Yi-heon pulled away. Later, before the whole court, he bowed deeply to his dead father and vowed to protect the throne with blood and tears. And from the outside, it looked like grief. From the inside, something else had already begun to rot. In the weeks that followed, the new king ruled like a man afraid of his own shadow. A conspiracy was uncovered, or perhaps invented, and at its supposed centre was little Yul's own grandfather. A rising figure at court named Minister Shin cut the old man down before he could finish defending himself, and then, horrifyingly, the child himself was marked as a traitor too. Yi-heon visited Yul in the prison where he was being held. The little boy, trusting as only a small child can be, threw his arms around his brother's neck. Yi-heon crouched, held him, and promised in a gentle voice that he was only being sent away for a while, that he would come back for him soon. And for the first time in a long time, his face looked almost human. Then the child was led away, and the softness slid off Yi-heon like a dropped mask. The boy did not survive his next meal. The food had been poisoned, and Minister Shin, the man who had made all of it possible, was rewarded handsomely. Meanwhile, in a far noisier world, a travelling troupe of street performers was reenacting these very events for a laughing crowd. Nobles and peasants watching side by side as the troupe's most talented young clown leapt high into the air and flung off his red mask. The face underneath was startling. It was the face of the king. Not Yi-heon himself, of course, but a young man named Harsun, a clown of uncertain birth who simply happened to look exactly like the ruler he mocked. Harsun was everything Yi Hyun was not: warm, playful, reckless in small, stubborn ways. When the noble who'd hired them refused to pay, Harsun snuck back over the wall and smashed the man's food jars for spite, then stole a small parcel of rare yellow fish for his troop. Most tenderly of all, when the youngest member of the troop, a tiny girl named Dal Lei, grew too tired to walk on the long road to the capital, Hassan simply hoisted her onto his back and kept going, grinning the whole way. He called her his sister, and that was the purest thing in his world. Back at the palace, Yi Haeon was unravelling. He had nightmares of little Yule crawling onto his bed, clutching his belly, begging to be saved. He woke drenched in dread, and before his terror could even settle, real assassins slipped into his chamber, only to be cut down by the guards and the loyal chief royal secretary, a man named Minister Lee. One assassin was taken alive. Yi Hyun offered to spare his life for a name, but instead of a name, the man spat the truth: that Yi Hyun had murdered his own brother, that the country knew he was unfit, and that Minister Shin ruled the nation while the king played with his women. Yi Hyun killed him on the spot, and then he kept slashing, long after the man had stopped breathing. Alone afterward, still soaked in blood, he pressed a sword to Minister Lee's throat and demanded to be told that his enemies would be wiped out. Minister Lee, a man whose loyalty ran deeper than anyone yet understood, could not lie. He only swore to protect his king with his last breath. Yi Hyun, shaking, begged him to find a way, because the truth was terrible and simple. He was losing his mind. Meanwhile, Hassan and his troop reached the capital and tried to talk their way into performing at a house of entertainment. A kind older woman named Wunshim took pity on the boy with a familiar face and suggested their next skit should mock the king's jealous queen and his beloved consort, Sun Huadang. That was what people wanted to laugh about these days. Inside the palace, Queen Su-woon was a gentle, thoughtful woman who had given up on trying to please the husband who did not love her. Huadang, the king's favoured consort, was the niece of Minister Shin himself, placed at court to bear an heir and shore up her uncle's power, when Yi Haeon discovered a fertility charm hidden on her, a charm that could only have come from Minister Shin. He exploded, force-feeding her the very food she had brought to tempt him, and then storming off to accuse the queen of doing nothing to give him a legitimate son. So Woon, quiet and devastating, let him come close enough to kiss her, then turned her face away. She told him softly that the world thought she was the one rejecting him, but only the two of them knew the truth. And then everything began to converge. Minister Shin moved to crush his rival, Minister Yu, the Queen's father. He twisted a captured assassin's confession so that Minister Yu appeared to be the traitor instead. Yi Haeon, too paranoid to see clearly, had his own father-in-law arrested. So Woon knelt in front of him and pleaded for her father's life, offering to step down as queen. Yi Haeon threatened her in return. Across the city, Minister Lee happened to be drinking at the very house of entertainment where Hassan's troupe was performing. When the young clown burst into his show, mocking the queen, Minister Lee stormed outside in a fury, grabbed him by the collar, and froze, because the face looking back at him was the king's. He had Hassan locked in a shed. And the next morning, when Yihon was once again terrorizing a palace maid over an imagined poisoning, Minister Lee finally spoke the words that would change everything. He told his king that in an old story, The trickster monkey plucked a hair from his own head and turned it into a second version of himself. Minister Li, it seemed, had just found a monkey's hair. Har-Sun, blindfolded and bewildered, was carried into the royal throne room. When the cloth was lifted from his eyes, he found himself staring at his own face, crowned, robed, and very, very dangerous. Yi Heon, amused for the first time in weeks, removed his own hat and placed it on the clown's head. He draped his crimson robe over Har-Sun's shoulders. He ordered him to say the words, "You fool." And when Har-Sun finally drew himself up and delivered the line with the exact regal cadence of the king himself, Yi Heon stared, silent for a long moment, and then burst into the laughter of a man balanced on the edge of madness. Somewhere in that laughter, a terrible plan was born, and somewhere in that laughter too, a clown's life stopped belonging to him. The plan Yi Heon had in mind for Har-Sun was brutally simple. The clown existed to be killed in his place. There was no need to train him, the king reasoned, because a corpse did not need etiquette. But Minister Li pointed out that an untrained double was worse than no double at all. A man who could not convincingly stand in for the king might be used against him. And so Har-Sun, terrified and newly aware that refusing meant his sister and his troop leader would be tortured in his stead, was pressed into service. The promise of riches at the end sweetened the pill a little, though he hid his grin when it counted. What followed was an education in the strange, suffocating choreography of royal life. Before dawn, court ladies poured into his room to wash his face and dress him. At breakfast, the food was so staggeringly delicious that he accidentally made a small, appreciative sound and instantly horrified the entire room. Eunuch Joe, the stiff and scolding attendant assigned to keep him from disaster, gave him endless warnings about restraint. Don't smile. Don't react. Don't let your feelings touch your face. Har-Sun was, of course, terrible at all three. His first brush with true disaster came when he accidentally crossed paths with the Queen herself. He had been warned to avoid her at all costs. Instead, he stared, slack-jawed, at her beauty, then tried to hide behind a wall when she approached, and finally, as she drew near, simply turned and fled. So-Woon was left blinking, confused, watching the king of the nation sprint away from her like a guilty schoolboy. Worse was coming. At court that day, Minister Shin walked in and asked the king's permission to have Minister Yu executed. Minister Li had given Har-Sun one clear rule. If anyone asked permission for something, simply approve it. So Har-Sun approved it, and then, only after Minister Shin had swept out the room, did Har-Sun innocently ask Eunuch Joe who Minister Yu was. Minister Yu was the Queen's father. When So-Woon heard that the king had just ordered her father beheaded, she came flying to his chambers. She dropped to her knees, drew out a tiny dagger, and pressed the blade to her own chest. Har-Sun, not Yi Heon, but Har-Sun, panicked and stumbling, lunged forward, tackled her to the ground, wrenched the knife from her hand, and promised her, breathless and wild, that he would save her father's life. She in turn promised him she would not try to die again. It was the first true promise ever made between them. Neither of them understood yet how much it would cost. When Minister Li found out what Har-Sun had done, he nearly throttled the boy. A king cannot simply change his orders on a whim, he raged. But Har-Sun, thinking fast, stood before the court the next day, unrolled the scroll of execution, pretended to read it, and at the last moment quietly changed beheading to exile. Minister Shin's face tightened. Minister Li's face went carefully blank, and Minister Yu's life was saved, at least for now. In the meantime, Hassan was becoming something more than a scared imposter. He noticed the tiny palace maid named Gyehuan, barely 15, who flinched whenever she served him because the real king had once force-fed her hot porridge out of spite. He noticed that she was hungry, that the maids ate only the king's leftovers, that she'd been sold to the palace because her father couldn't pay an unfair tax. He told her gently as to taste his food before he ate it, not to guard against poison, but so that she could eat. And as she tucked into the royal porridge with quiet gratitude, he sat and watched her and thought about Dal-Lay. That same night, someone slipped poison into the sweets meant for Hassan's bedtime snack. Gyehuan delivered the tray. Hassan, moved by her story, offered her one of his treats. She ate it, smiled, and within seconds, she was convulsing in his arms, bleeding from the mouth. He ran with her body to the royal physician, but there was nothing to be done. A child he had barely known was dead in his place. And somewhere in the middle of that horror, another one arrived. The warm, mischievous noble's son who had been eyeing tiny Dal-Lay at the house of entertainment had paid a servant to deliver her to his home. When she refused him, he beat her. By the time Hassan, shattered by Gyehuan's death, escaped the palace through a hidden tunnel to find his sister, Dal-Lay could no longer speak. She could only cling to him. The man who had done it was Shin Yi-Gyom, Minister Shin's son. Hassan hid his face behind a clown's mask and stormed the Shin household with the servant at knife point, demanding justice. What he received was a beating and 2 coins, 2 yang, roughly the price of a dog at market, tossed contemptuously in the dirt beside him. His sister's suffering, he was told, was worth that much and not a copper more. He could have run. He could have vanished with his troop into the countryside and let the palace eat itself alive. Instead, at dawn, Minister Li found him back in the king's chambers, wearing the crimson robes on his own. There was something different in Hassan's face now, something harder, something chosen. I came back, he told Minister Li, to learn how to trample a man until he can no longer breathe. Teach me. And in that moment, a clown stopped being a clown. The question now was whether the palace would make him into a king, or simply into another Yi Hion. Minister Li did not quite believe what he was hearing. He snatched up Hassan's sword and set the blade against his throat, half expecting the boy to crumble. Instead, Hassan raised his chin and stepped into the blade. A flicker of real respect passed across Minister Li's face, though he was careful not to let it settle there. Hassan's offer was direct. He would do whatever Minister Li asked. Suffer, lie, even die, on one condition. He wanted the power of the throne long enough to destroy the man who destroyed his sister. Minister Li, after a long pause, agreed, and in that agreement, a partnership was born that neither of them had planned on. What Hassan didn't know was that Minister Li carried his own wounds. Somewhere in his past was the name Lord Gilsam Bong, a man who had died for a dream of a better nation, a dream Minister Li had failed to defend when it mattered. And somewhere in the present was a king slipping further into drug-soaked madness in a remote mountain hermitage, carving black paste across his own face as his last shreds of sanity burned away. That was the man Minister Li was supposed to be loyal to. The question of why he kept choosing Hassan instead was one he wasn't ready to answer, even to himself. The days that followed were Hassan's first real lessons in palace warfare. Minister Li sent him to visit the Queen Dowager, the mother of the murdered little Prince Yule, a woman whose grief had curdled into something deeply dangerous. He was told to throw a tantrum, to refuse her tea, to accuse her of treachery. Hassan, terrified, did exactly that, flipping a table and dragging Queen So-woon from the room before the Queen Dowager could humiliate her further. So-woon, outside in the courtyard, pulled her wrist out of his hand and told him, trembling, that if he truly meant to protect her, he must never do that again. His clumsy fury was exactly the kind of thing his enemies would use. It was the first time she'd spoken to him like a partner rather than a subject, and the first time he realised just how carefully she'd been surviving all on her own. Later that night, alone in his room, Hassan and Eunuch Joe shared a single sweet meant for the king. Unable to eat anything that reminded them of Gihwan, slowly, carefully, something like friendship was beginning to grow in the corners of that cold palace. Then came the hunt. Yi Haeon had always been a skilled archer, which meant Hassan needed to pretend to be one, to everyone's astonishment. When he picked up a bow for practice, he put arrow after arrow into the centre of the target. He had, it turned out, spent a great deal of his life gambling on illicit shooting contests. He was better than the real king. Minister Li, struggling not to laugh, could only shake his head. The hunt itself was meant to be a performance of royal health, but it was also a trap. Prince Jin Pyong, next in line for the throne, and scheming quietly with the Queen Dowager, had brought hunting dogs that might expose the king's paranoia. Hassan calmed them with a scrap of tiger fur tucked into his sleeve. And then, when the group split up, Yi Gyeom, Dallei's rapist, volunteered to accompany him into the forest. This was exactly what Hassan had been waiting for. He slipped away from his guards. He drew his bow. He thought of Dallei's small, bruised face, and then, just as Prince Jin Pyong drew his own bow to put an arrow through the king's back, Minister Li came crashing through the brush shouting Hassun's title. Hassun released, Prince Jin Pyong released, and by some miracle, Hassun's arrow found its mark, not Yi Gyeom's heart, but the fabric between his legs, pinning him to a tree in the most humiliating possible way. Prince Jin Pyong's arrow buried itself harmlessly behind Hassun instead. Alone with Hassan afterward, Minister Li slammed him against a tree and demanded to know what he had been thinking. And here was the thing that surprised them both. Hassan had not missed. He had chosen. Killing Yi Gyeom now would mean calling it an accident, which would mean no one would ever know what he had done. Hassan wanted more than vengeance. He wanted the world to see. Minister Li slowly let him go, looking at the young clown with something very close to wonder. On their return, one of the hunting dogs lunged at the queen. Hassan threw himself between them and took the bite across his forearm. Saved, once again, by the tiger fur still tucked in his sleeve, and when Prince Jin Pyong tried to kill the dog for its mistake, Hassan stopped him with a line that made several people in that courtyard look at him differently. "If we take a life for every mistake," he said, "no lives would be left." So-woon led him to have his wound tended. Hwa Dang came bustling in to fuss. Court Lady Kim, Minister Shin's quiet spy, watched the Queen's eyes on the king and filed away every small thing, and Hassan, alone with So-woon, found himself apologising silently for every cruel skit he had ever performed about this gentle, lonely woman. Night fell, and somewhere in the palace, So-woon crept out alone to a little bridge over a stream where her lady sometimes tossed pebbles into a floating bowl to make wishes. She threw a hazelnut. It missed, and a voice behind her said, It won't go in if you throw it like that." Her son was there. They stood side by side in the dark and threw stones together. Their pebbles landed cleanly. A flurry of fireflies lifted from the water and spun around them like fallen stars, and So-woon, serious, proper So-woon, closed her eyes and made her wish. When she opened them, her son was watching her. She asked him what he had wished for, and very quietly, as if handing her something fragile, he said, "My wish is to see you smile, big and bright." Neither of them said anything after that for a long time. On the walk back, So-woon stumbled on a loose stone, and her son quietly began kicking every pebble out of her path ahead of her. She didn't see him do it. He preferred it that way. It was such a small thing, and yet once you noticed it, it was impossible not to understand exactly what was happening to him. She returned to her rooms glowing. Her attendant, gently scolding her for walking alone, was waved off. So-woon didn't need tea that night, she said, because something outside had already warmed her. And Ha-sun, sneaking back through the secret tunnel behind his bed, screamed bloody murder when he found Minister Lee waiting for him in the dark. Minister Lee lectured him. People were beginning to notice that the king seemed different, kinder, steadier, sparing his father-in-law, sparing the dog, Ha-sun, eyes suddenly cool, handed Minister Lee a small, wrapped object. It was the arrowhead Prince Jinpyong had fired at him in the forest. Someone had tried to kill him during the hunt, and Minister Lee had not told him. "I agreed to risk my life," Ha-sun said, "but I never agreed to die blind." It was the first time he had put Minister Lee in his place. It would not be the last. Their next crisis came from a direction neither of them expected. The consort Hwadang collapsed at a tea gathering, vomiting blood, claiming she'd been cursed. A straw doll pierced with needles was produced as evidence. A palace maid conveniently pointed the finger at So-woon's most trusted attendant, Court Lady Park. And just like that, the Queen's entire household was under suspicion. Ha-sun wanted to fight back immediately. Minister Lee told him that in matters of the inner court, the wisest king did nothing at all. Women fought, he said, and men ignored. Ha-sun didn't like that answer. Ha-sun was not going to be that kind of king. It was Young, So-woon's loyal maid, who found the thread that unravelled everything. A visit to Court Lady Park's grieving family turned up a letter in which Court Lady Park, before her sudden, suspicious death in prison, had confessed to something. She had been performing witchcraft, but not against Hwadang. Her target had been the Queen herself, and the person who had ordered it was the Queen Dowager. So-woon, holding the evidence, told Ha-sun to use it to destroy the Queen Dowager outright. Minister Lee agreed. Ha-sun refused. He was not willing to sacrifice the Queen in a trade, even a winning one. It was an answer that surprised both of them, and it was the answer he was going to keep giving, again and again, until the palace learned to stop asking. Instead, Ha-sun walked into the Queen Dowager's chambers himself. He set down a copy of the letter, and he told her, calmly, that she would produce the person who had poisoned Court Lady Park within 2 hours, or he would hand the original letter to the court. The Queen Dowager scoffed. She called his bluff. He named her favourite attendant, he set his price, and he left. 2 hours later, Court Lady Jiang, who had served the Queen Dowager since both of them were 16, knelt at Ha-sun's door confessing to everything. She had known she would die for her mistress. The Queen Dowager had promised her a proper funeral in return. At court the next morning, Minister Shin stormed in demanding the Queen Dowager's dethronement Hassan cut him off cold. He refused to let the Queen Dowager be accused. He accepted Court Lady Yang's confession alone. He saved Queen So-woon's honour without destroying the royal mother who had tried to curse her. It was a manoeuvre so deft that even Minister Shin could do nothing but smile thinly and plan his next move. Afterward, Hassan stood looking out over the lake, exhausted, and saw So-woon in a nearby pavilion. She bowed to him in thanks, and then, for him, she smiled, a full, unguarded, luminous smile, exactly the wish he'd made by the Firefly Bridge. Hassan smiled back, and then, because he could not help it, he whispered to himself, "Please, do not smile like that. Please." Because he had just realised something he was not allowed to realise. He was in love with the wife of a king he was only pretending to be. Meanwhile, far from the palace, the real king, Yi-heon, had sunk deeper into hell. When Minister Lee finally reached him at the mountain temple, he found the king bleeding heavily from his own ear. Yi-heon had been trying, with a sharpened stick, to dig out the voice of little Yule whispering inside his skull. He collapsed in Minister Lee's arms. There was no king to come back to the palace, not anymore. Minister Lee returned alone and told Hassan to change into commoner's clothes. He led him up to a cliff above the city, ignoring his questions, and at the edge, he drew a knife and drove it into Hassun's chest. "Hassan the clown is dead," Minister Lee said quietly. "You are now the king of this nation." The wound was shallow, just enough to leave a scar that matched a scar Yi-heon had earned long ago in the uprising. Just enough to make Hassan real. The clown who had entered the palace to be a decoy and a corpse now wore, in his own flesh, the mark of the king he was going to have to replace. Not for a few days, not until the real king recovered, for as long as the nation needed him. And somewhere deep inside him, though he could not yet name it, Hassan had already decided that he would not merely wear the throne, he would try to be worthy of it. When Hassan woke bandaged in his bed, Minister Lee was sitting beside him. For the first time, he explained the full weight of what had just happened. The real king was gone, perhaps forever. The throne could not be allowed to appear empty, or the country would dissolve into bloodshed. Hassun was not a decoy anymore. He was the only thing holding the kingdom together. Hassun did not run. He did not even protest much. He simply asked what had to be done. What had to be done, as it turned out, was a great deal. The country was starving. The anniversary of the late Queen Mother's death was approaching, and tradition called for mountains of rice to be distributed to the poor. Minister Shin, who controlled the court's purse strings, insisted instead that the rice be spent on finishing the new palace, a monument to royal authority. Hassun refused. He wanted the people fed. The Minister of Taxation explained why that was harder than it sounded. Across the country, provincial officials were hoarding rice tributes and growing rich on the difference. They demanded strange, expensive goods as tax, and then took bribes from the merchants who sold those goods. The poor paid for everything. A little girl like Gaiwan could be sold to the palace because her father couldn't afford a tax he should never have been asked to pay. There was a solution, buried in an old law, a rice payment law that would tax only those who owned land. But implementing it would require precise calculations for every region in the country. And there was only one man in the kingdom who could do those calculations. His name was Ju Ho-gyeol, a brilliant accountant born to a slave mother, who wasted his talents gambling in back alleys because no one would ever let a man of his birth do anything else. Minister Lee found him, saved him from a beating, and dragged him to the palace. Ho-gyeol, sullen and suspicious, agreed only to gamble with the king over his service. Whoever won got a favour. Hassan won every single hand. And then, once Hogyel had agreed to work for him, casually shook a small armful of cheating sticks out of his sleeve and grinned. He had never intended to force the man. He had only wanted to get him through the door. Hogyel stared at him like he had never seen a king before, and maybe he hadn't. But Minister Shin had been watching. A lesser minister recognised Hogyel as the long-lost son of a disgraced official, killed in the old conspiracy that had destroyed Lord Gil's reform group. Minister Shin pieced together quickly what was happening, that the throne was quietly moving against him, and that Hogyel was the key. He struck back. At the next court assembly, his faction moved to dismiss the Minister of Taxation, which would kill the rice law before it was ever born. Minister Li went to meet Hogyel in secret that night to gather evidence of embezzlement. He arrived just in time to see assassins strike the young man down. Back at the palace, So-woon brought Hassan's nightly medicine to the library herself. She found him asleep among the books. She sat beside him. She touched his face, and then, believing he could not hear her, she began to speak about how she'd been finding reasons all day to pass by his chambers, about how she kept watching the direction of his window the way other people watched the moon. She told him, softly, that she'd fallen in love with him. Then she leaned down and kissed him, and Hassan's eyes flew open. Before either of them could find a single word to say, a stranger problem was unfolding elsewhere. Somewhere in a small mountain hut, guarded by a gentle monk named Jung Saeng and a frightened Gapsu, little Dalle, still unable to speak from shock, had begun to notice a figure being kept locked inside. A man who looked exactly like her brother. A man who was not her brother at all. The real king was awake, and he was going to come home. Hassan, caught with the queen's lips still on his, did the only thing his panicked body knew how to do. He hiccuped, violently. So-woon sprang to her feet. They walked back to his chambers in a daze of shared embarrassment. Eunuch Joe offering a parade of useless remedies, So-woon biting back laughter. She eventually slipped away, glowing, telling her maid that the moon and stars seemed brighter tonight, even though the sky was cloudy. Hassan's hiccups, of course, stopped the moment she was gone. But between the kiss and the hiccups and the stolen glances, something serious had been set in motion. He soon realised, properly for the first time, that the woman he was falling in love with believed she was falling in love with her husband. She had no idea Hassan even existed, and everything tender she had given him. The letter, the hazelnuts, the confession in the library had been offered to a man whose name she did not know. That grief settled into him even as he threw himself into the work of saving the rice law. Hogyel turned out to be alive. Minister Li had intercepted his assassins, paid the would-be killers 10 times Yi-gyum's bribe to fake his death, and hidden the mathematician while he worked through the night. At the next court assembly, the accountant walked in behind Mu Young, alive and smelling faintly of the real corpses he'd been lying among for effect, much to Yi-gyum's horror. He presented ironclad proof of embezzlement, and when Mu Young produced the assassin who confessed that Yi-gyum had ordered the hit, Hassan had the moment he had been waiting for. What he did next was a small masterpiece of cruelty. He could not legally have Yi-gyum executed. The boy was the son of a minister, protected by every rule the court could muster, so he refused to execute him at all. Instead, he ordered Minister Shin to flog his own son with a cane 100 times in front of everyone. And he made himself watch every stroke. It was not enough for what had been done to Dal-Lay. It was nowhere near enough, but it was the start of something. Afterward, Hogale was freed from his slave status and given a minor but crucial post in the ministry. The rice law moved forward, and a young man who had spent his life gambling in alleys walked out of the throne room looking, for the first time, like he believed his future was his own. It was also the moment Hassan discovered that governance could be joyful. But peace was never going to last. Deep in the hut where the king had been hidden, tiny Dal-Lay crept out to the locked shed, peeked through a crack in the door, and saw a man inside who looked exactly like her brother. She cut him free with a small knife he showed her where to find. She thought she had saved Hassan. She had actually freed Yi Hyeon. And outside the hut, wholly unaware, Minister Lee was being attacked in the street. A band of child beggars, paid, handled, and sent by someone powerful, stabbed him in the stomach with a whispered message. Good luck in the afterlife. Hogale found him and dragged him to safety. Wunshim stayed up all night at his side. The monk Jungseng patched him up and begged him to stop trying to build a better world before it killed him. Minister Lee, weakened but undeterred, did not stop. He wrote again to the scattered survivors of Lord Gill's old reform group and asked them to gather once more. Meanwhile, So-woon fell ill, quietly, almost gracefully, a collapse in her chambers, a dizziness that wouldn't leave. The royal physician recommended she go to a mountain cottage to rest. Hassan, terrified of letting her go and even more terrified of what he might do if she stayed, agreed. He watched her palanquin leave the palace, and at the last possible moment, when she stepped out to offer him a small farewell bow, he broke into a run, but she was already gone. 3 days passed, 3 long, strange, aching days, and then, because the heart is a stubborn and foolish thing, So-woon decided she felt better and came home. She did not go straight to the palace. It was the double 9th festival, and a young coaxed her into exploring the markets one last time. Hassan, disguised as a nobleman, had slipped out himself to try, and fail, to send a letter to Dal-Lay. His guard, Mu Young, stayed close, and the two of them walked straight into a festival crowd, both of them hunting ghosts, neither of them expecting to find each other. So-woon turned on a small bridge, and there he was. Hassan turned, and there she was. And that was the moment the real king, dazed and stumbling through the same crowd with Dal-Lay limping behind him, finally raised his head. Dal-Lay's voice cracked out of her throat for the first time since her assault. She called out, "Orabeoni! Brother!" Yi Hyeon turned, and so did Hassan. The two men, for one strangely silent instant, looked in each other's direction. They did not see each other, but Yi Hyeon, cold, narrow-eyed, and perfectly aware of his wife's face, saw Hassan holding Queen So-woon's hand. And he began, very slowly, to shake with fury. The crowd swallowed them all before either Kingface could see the other. Yi Hyeon, half blind with drugs and half blind with rage, stumbled his way toward the palace gates by instinct alone. Dal-Lay, still believing she was following her brother, limped after him, lost him in the market, and eventually found Gap-Su and the monk searching for her. For the first time in weeks, she could speak. She told them her brother was here. She told them the monk had been keeping him prisoner. Gap-Su didn't know what to say. Back at the festival, So-woon and Hassan tried, one last time, to pretend they were ordinary. He took her to a small stall and she ate pork heart and intestines for the first time in her life, making a valiant face through it then genuinely liking it. She asked him which of the little houses on the street he would want to live in. He pointed to the smallest one at the end. "Closer to you," he said. "Longest walk home together." She bought him a small red compass with a lotus carved on its cover. She told him that, even if he had to take the long way around, he could use it to find his way back to her. He promised to keep it with him always. They didn't know yet that those would turn out to be important words. When Harsun finally snuck back into the palace that night, he found Eunuch Joe's face drained of all colour. Yihyun was back, wearing his own crimson robes, sitting at his own desk, reading the royal journal of everything that had happened while he was gone. Hassan dropped to his hands and knees. Yihyun kicked him. Eunuch Joe begged him to stop. Mu Young, unaware that Harsun had ever been anything but the king, burst in and was almost run through before Harsun threw himself in front of the blade, and then, in front of all of them, Yihyun demanded to know what the clown had been doing with his wife. Harsun swore nothing had happened. Yihyun did not believe him. When Minister Lee arrived, bound and escorted at sword point, Yihyun turned the blade on him instead. He accused his most loyal servant of treason. He ordered him to kill Harsun as proof of his loyalty. Minister Lee refused, argued, pleaded, and eventually, when Yihyun pressed the point, swung the sword himself, cutting Hassan's arm as Hassan flung himself out of the way. It was theatre of a sort. It was also the moment Minister Lee realised he could no longer pretend he was on the king's side. Yihyun, exhausted and triumphant, ordered Mu Young to take Hassan into the forest and leave him for the tigers, and Mu Young, who had spent his whole life learning to obey without questioning, did as he was told. He tossed Hassan into a deep pit in the woods and walked away. Meanwhile, in So-woon's chambers, Yihyun, unaware that he was no longer the man she'd learned to love, summoned the queen. She came to him cheerful, glowing, still believing he was the one who had walked the market at her side. She told him so. She told him that spending the day with him had been better than any medicine. Yihan's hand shook with fury as he listened to her describe a tenderness he had never given her. He pulled her down. He began to untie her clothes. He told her he was going to remind her who she belonged to. And somewhere inside him, a splitting headache, a drug withdrawal migraine he could not outrun, cut through the rage. He collapsed. He staggered back to his chambers and screamed for everyone to leave him alone. Minister Lee put him to bed. Then, alone with his sleeping king, Minister Lee pulled out the written order Yehaeon had left behind. It was an order to depose So-woon and force her to drink poison. Minister Lee burned it over a candle, and then, very quietly, he began to make other arrangements. At dawn, in the pit, Hassan woke bruised, bound, and completely alone. His hand closed around the small red compass in his sleeve. He said aloud, "To no one, Your Highness, I seem to have lost my way again." He tried to climb. He slid back. He tried again. He almost made it to the top. And then something large snarled at him from the trees, and he fell. He was still alive, and barely, when Mu Young returned to collect his head. Mu Young leaned over the edge of the pit. Hassan's hand shot up and grabbed his arm. Mu Young drew his sword. Then, slowly, he drove it into the ground and used it to haul the clown back out of the grave he'd been left in. Hassan took the sword. He could have killed the guard. Instead, he threw it into the pit and told Mu Young that saving his own life was not worth the price of someone else's. Mu Young asked him where he intended to go. Hassan's answer was quiet. "My destination is already set. I will return to the palace. What I cherish most is there. I cannot leave it behind." Minister Li had been making arrangements of his own. He'd quietly drafted a royal order confining the Queen Dowager. He'd arranged for Jung Seing to meet him at the rear gate of the palace. And when Yi Heon, feverish, shattered, screaming for court ladies and opium, was finally lured into a carriage, Minister Li had him driven back into the mountains, back to the hermitage, back to the place where he could no longer hurt anyone. When Hassan returned, bloody and barely standing, Minister Li met him in the throne room. He did not apologize. He simply asked Hassan what he wanted to do. And Hassan, without hesitation, said, "I want power. I want the power to protect the people I cherish more than my life. I want to be the real king." Minister Li looked at him for a long time. Then he told him the truth of what that meant. It meant blood. It meant taking lives. It meant giving up even his own heart. Hassan, trembling but steady, said he could do it, and Minister Li promised him that, whatever came, he would not leave him. Later that night, Minister Li, Mu Young, and the monk Jung Seng met at the back gate. They had a cart with them. Inside the cart was Yi Heon, unconscious, fever-bright, ordinary. He was driven into the woods, and Minister Li rode with him to a quiet beach Yi Heon had once loved as a boy. On that beach, Minister Li poured his king a drink, listened patiently while Yi Heon spoke of sailing to faraway nations and building a powerful empire, and then watched him drop his cup and clutch his stomach. The poison worked quickly. Yi Heon understood, all at once, what was happening. He wept, he raged, he begged, he asked if little Yul had suffered this way. Minister Li knelt beside him and answered every question gently, and did not look away. "I'm not giving up on you," Minister Li told him. "I chose our nation. I chose its people. I chose the new world." Yi Heon gasped that he was afraid that in the afterlife, no one would care who he had been. And then he stopped breathing, and Minister Li, with tears running freely down his face, stood up and bowed once, deeply, formally, to the king he had just murdered. Back in the palace, alone in the king's chambers, Hassan was still trying to understand what had just happened to him. He was alive. He was wearing a scar he had not asked for, and Minister Li was somewhere out in the dark, finishing the piece of the plan Hassan had not been told about. When Minister Li returned, grim and hollowed out, the two men did not speak for a long time. Then Hassan, who had guessed more than Minister Li realized, quietly asked where the real king was. Minister Li said only that he was far away, and that he would not be coming back. The rest, they both understood, would not need to be said for a while yet. What they said instead was simpler and heavier. Minister Li promised Hassan, not as a handler, but as a man who had just chosen a side, that he would protect him. "Engrave this moment on your heart," he said. "Whatever danger may befall us, I will not leave you." And for the first time, Hassan believed him all the way through. There were practical problems to face first. Yi Heon's birthday was 2 days away, and the court had planned a vast celebration. Hassan asked that the feast be cancelled and the food given to the people instead. Minister Li looked almost proud as he agreed to arrange it. Meanwhile, Minister Shin, furious at his son's disgrace, was planning a strike of his own. The desperate village head whose party the clown troupe had once performed at had come to him with a strange story, a clown who looked exactly like the king. Minister Shin began to remember how differently the king had been behaving lately, and a terrible suspicion began to form. He ordered posters printed across the city. On them was a portrait of the king's face and an accusation that an impostor sat on the throne. The notices went up by morning. Minister Li scrambled to have them torn down. Ha-sun, at court, was forced to pretend outrage at the very rumour he was the subject of, and managed it, barely. Court Lady Kim, still secretly in Minister Shin's service, began looking for confirmation in a new and far more dangerous way. Ha-sun, at Minister Li's suggestion, walked straight through the trap. He allowed Court Lady Kim to drug his tea. He pretended to fall asleep, and when she slipped in through the secret passage to check his chest for the scar, he was waiting for her. He grabbed her wrist. He sat up with eyes so cold and a voice so precisely Yi Heon's that she nearly fainted on the spot. The clown, after all, had spent his whole life being other people, becoming this one. The ghost of the king he had replaced was, in its own terrible way, the easiest performance he had ever given. Court Lady Kim was taken away. Minister Li sent her back to Minister Shin with instructions to confess the plot and offer testimony in exchange for her life. What happened next made it clear just how alone she really was. Minister Shin stripped her of her protection, dismissed her, and made it clear that her usefulness was finished. On the morning of the king's birthday, with Minister Shin's forged accusations still circulating through the city, So Woon came to Ha-sun with a small homemade meal and the other consorts trailing behind. Hua Dang presented a golden tortoise, an auspicious symbol of long life. So Woon, at the last second, tucked her own gift away. She had brought the same thing. Ha-sun, rather than keep the tortoise, suggested it be sold to buy rice for the poor. The consorts struggled not to laugh. So Woon, quietly, beamed. And in the mountain hut that night, while Ha-sun fed the people of his own nation, Minister Li fed Yi Heon his last meal of rice and seaweed soup. He held the cup to the king's mouth because the king's hands were shaking too badly to hold it himself. He let Yi Heon dream aloud of the powerful nation he would build. He took him to the sea, and then, with grief so deep it looked almost like devotion, he gave him the drink that ended it. 2 rulers ate supper on the same birthday. One was served by the man he trusted most, who loved him enough to kill him. The other was served by the woman he had pretended to be married to, who loved him without knowing his name. Only one of them would wake up in the morning. The palace shifted that night, though almost no one felt it. A king had died on a beach. Another king, without title, without birth, without right, was eating seaweed soup in the palace and trying to pretend his hands weren't shaking. In the library the next evening, Ha-sun and So Woon met quietly. She gave him a small brush pouch she had embroidered with a pair of cranes. On the back were words he could not yet read. She spoke them aloud for him. 1,000 years apart will not change my love for you. And Ha-sun, the impostor king, the clown, the boy who had once been paid 2 yang for his sister's life, took a breath and did something he should not have done and could not help. He recited back to her, word for word, the love confession she had whispered to him the night she kissed him in this very library, believing he was asleep. "I have fallen in love with you," he said. "My heart feels like it will explode, and I wouldn't mind." They both had tears in their eyes by the time he was done. A few nights later, quietly, in a cave in the mountains, Mu Young left a letter of resignation on Minister Li's desk, bowed once toward the palace, and walked away from his old life. He did not know yet that he would not be able to stay away. Because the morning after that, the posters reappeared in the city. Not Minister Shin's old ones, new ones. And then, while Har-sun was reeling, Minister Shin's remaining allies began posting notices across the capital, accusing the king of being a clown. People looked, people laughed, people started to wonder. Har-sun, for the first time, understood what it felt like to be hunted by a rumour. Minister Li stepped into court and cut the panic off at its knees. The court was arguing over whether to arrest every clown in the kingdom. He silenced them all by asking the simpler question: why did the people no longer trust the king enough to laugh these posters off as jokes? The ministers had no answer. Har-sun, watching, learned another lesson about how power actually worked. But Minister Shin was not finished. He had to court Lady Kim, or what was left of her, or so he thought. Har-sun had her quietly removed from the king's personal service. Minister Shin ordered her to check the king's chest for Yi-Heon's old scar, and this time, when she crept into his chambers in the middle of the night after drugging his tea, it was Har-sun who caught her by the wrist, because Har-sun now had a scar of his own in exactly the right place. It was a trap. Minister Li had been setting it for days. Court Lady Kim, confronted with the evidence, was sent back to Minister Shin under watch, to gather more confession from him in exchange for her life. What she did not know was that Minister Shin would outmaneuver them both, catch her out, and make her disappear. Mu Young, who had quietly returned to the city, began shadowing Minister Shin personally. In the middle of all of this, the posters, the schemes, the slow tightening of the noose around the palace, Har-sun did something both tender and foolish. He began leaving So-woon small notes tucked inside the books he sent her. Playful ones, sweet ones. One said, "Come to the highest place in the palace. I will be waiting for you there." She went. He had planned it so that the first snow of winter would fall while they stood there. It worked. The snowflakes looked like falling stars. So-woon threw her arms around his neck and laughed, and for one long moment the palace didn't exist. He kissed her. Somewhere in her hand, behind his back, was the note she was still holding, the one that said, "Even if I die missing you, I am happy to have known you." Neither of them knew yet how much of a warning that note was going to turn out to be. The snow kept falling on the balcony long after they had gone back inside. In the library, So-woon looked at Har-sun with new shyness and asked if she could give him a child. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. Har-sun, staring at her, could not find a single word. He was saved, for now, by Minister Li, who arrived with urgent business. Later that night, alone. Minister Li asked Har-sun a difficult question. Was the queen the person he had come to the palace to protect? Har-sun admitted she was one of them. And Minister Li, gently but without flinching, told him the truth. "You are deceiving her," he said. "Even now that you're the real king, you will always be fake to her. She is the most upright person in this palace. If you tell her, you will break her. If you don't tell her, you will break yourself. And while you are busy breaking, the country will be left undefended." Har-sun heard him. He didn't argue. He was already trying to find a way to tell her. The rest of the world, however, was not going to wait. The court case against Minister Shin was still unfolding. Har-sun moved to promote the accountant Ho-geol, and to open the state examination to sons of concubines, a step that shook the entire noble class. When a crowd of offended students blocked Ho-geol from entering the palace and shouted that the king would have to walk over their backs to pass, Har-sun simply took off his shoes and did exactly that. He walked across them, calmly, took Hogyel's hand, and led him inside. It was a moment people would be telling stories about for years. Hogyel, for his part, never quite looked at Hassan the same way again. Two new young officials, Jongrim and Jae-gu, both former followers of Lord Gil's old reform group, passed the exam and entered the court. For the first time in years, Minister Lee began to allow himself to believe the world he had buried might be possible again. But Minister Shin had seen Dal-Lei in the city, or rather, one of his men had. He knew now that the clown had a sister. He began searching for her, quietly, with all the patience of a man preparing to win. And while Hassan was busy being a king, he did something very small and very careless. He left a few pages of his handwriting practice tucked into a book in the library, Chinese characters, carefully copied, because he could not read them, because he had been teaching himself in secret, because the real king had written in a steady hand, and he had not. So Woon came looking for him. She didn't find him. She found the papers. She put things together very quickly after that. The scar, the sudden dislike of Ginger, the way he had not recognized her by the lake the first time, the way he had held her hand in the marketplace, the posters, the rumour, the look-alike. She walked straight to his chambers, still holding the evidence. He arrived glowing, because he had just finished reading her love letter. He told her he had a confession to make. She looked at him stone-faced and did not answer him. Instead, she asked him two very quiet questions. "Do you remember the day we first met? What is my name?" Hassan could not answer either one. Her eyes filled with tears. She stepped back. The papers slipped out of her hand. "Who are you?" she asked him. And the clown who had walked across the backs of Sung Kyun Kwan students and across the body of a dead king and across everything a man was ever supposed to walk across, had no answer at all. Hassan reached for her. She flinched away from him as if he had burned her. When he tried to catch her as she stumbled, she struck his hands off and told him he had no right to touch her. And then, with that terrible precise calm that had always been hers, she walked out. She made it as far as her own chambers before she collapsed in a young's arms. Eunuch Joe, finding Hassan shaking and sobbing in the dark of his rooms, did the kindest thing he could think of. He sent for Minister Lee, and Minister Lee went not to Hassan, but to the Queen. He knelt. He told her the truth. All of it. He told her about Yi Haeon's madness, about the drugs, about the long journey into the mountains and the longer journey out of them. He told her that Yi Haeon had died. He told her he himself had chosen the nation over the king. He offered, formally and without excuses, to have Hassan removed if she wished it. And he warned her that removing Hassan now would turn the palace into a bloodbath. So Woon heard it all. Her face moved slowly from shock into something much harder. She told Minister Lee not to try to control her with threats, and he said he wasn't trying to. He was only begging her to think clearly. And then she made a decision of her own, quietly. The next morning, she announced that she was leaving the palace. Hassan ran to her chambers. She was already gone in all the ways that mattered. She looked at him with cold eyes and asked him, calmly, a string of small questions. Had he been the one who'd spared her father? Who'd taken the hunting dog's bite for her? Who'd walked with her through the festival? The answers were all in his face. She already knew. "I hope to never see your face again," she told him. "You will no longer look for me, either." Hassan sent Mu Young running to Minister Lee. Minister Lee caught up to her at the gates. He did not argue. He simply called her by her name. So Wuna, the way someone who had known her since she was a girl would. He told her that her father had opposed making her queen because she was too kind for the palace, but that he himself had chosen her because he believed her kindness could stand its ground. He asked her to stay. She did not answer. She kept walking. The Queen Dowager, sensing blood in the water, demanded that So-woon be deposed and made to drink poison. Hasun refused. The Queen Dowager screamed that a wife who dared to walk out without her husband's permission deserved death. Hasun told her, flatly, that the Queen was his person before she was anyone else's subject, and he would handle his own people as he saw fit. He left her chambers to find Minister Lee waiting with a formal order of deposition. Deposing her, Minister Lee said, was the only way to save her life. The court would soon demand poison, and only by stripping her of the title could they hide her outside the palace. Hasun threw the scroll at his feet and walked past him. He was going to find her himself. Meanwhile, across the border, new danger was rising. Reports came in that Jurchen soldiers were attacking. The great balance of power between Ming and the rising Aesanguren was tipping, and Joseon, small, exhausted Joseon, was going to be crushed between them if it could not find a way through. Minister Lee, who had been carrying this fear alone for weeks, dispatched a secret envoy to the Jurchen General Nurhachi to plead for neutrality. The man he sent was a merchant spy who seemed to have his own quiet sorrows. Minister Shin, meanwhile, had his own plan. He had hired a sickly village head to tell him about the clown troupe that had performed in his house. He had a notice put out to find the clown's leader, and he had summoned Wunshim, Minister Lee's oldest friend, to his home and demanded she tell him where Hasun was. When she would not, he ordered her beaten. Minister Lee arrived just in time. Hasun had been right about where So-woon would go. She went to her exiled father. Minister Yu, still frail, believed she had come with the king's blessing. She let him believe it, and in the evening she sat outside his little cottage and cried. That night, she could not sleep. She thought about the man who had held her, hand in the marketplace. She thought about the man who had stood in the library reciting her own love confession back to her. She thought about how both of those men had been lies. At dawn, she walked out of the cottage alone. She walked deep into the woods. She walked to the edge of a cliff. Her son found her there. He grabbed her just before she stepped off. She spat that it was none of his business whether she killed herself. He begged her to punish him instead, and she told him to stop speaking. The more he spoke, the worse her sin became. It is my sin, she said. I ask myself 1,000 times who was in my heart, you or him. I wanted to deny it, but I could not lie to myself. She started to walk toward the edge again. He caught her hand. Can't you live for me? He asked. From the moment I entered the palace, I faced 1,000 ways to die, and every time I wanted to live because of you. I wanted to be with you, even if only for a day. She remembered her own love letter. She remembered writing those very words to him. And somewhere in the trees behind them, an arrow whistled past Hasun's ear. He threw himself over her. The second arrow slammed into his back. He sank slowly to his knees with his arms still wrapped around her, and she screamed. Mu Young had been following at a careful distance. He came bursting through the underbrush with his sword already drawn, knocking arrows out of the air as he ran. He drove the attackers off. He did not catch them, but he bought Hasun enough time to survive. Hasun woke in a small room, dazed, half expecting So-woon to be gone. She wasn't. She was sitting beside him, and when she saw him open his eyes, she told him that in the moment she had thought she might lose him, She had been more afraid than she had been at the edge of the cliff. She had thought, she said, that she had to die to pay for her sin. But she had been wrong. If the world meant to condemn her, so be it. She wanted to live beside him. Hassan, tears running freely now, said she had just saved 2 lives, because if she had died, he would have gone with her. But even that small piece had almost no time to breathe. Back in the capital, the Ming envoys had arrived a full day early, demanding audience. Minister Li went to meet them alone, the senior envoy, furious at being received by a mere secretary, drew his sword and pressed it to Minister Li's throat. Minister Li did not move. He told the envoy that even if he was killed here, Joseon could not bend, and that the envoy surely didn't want to be the man who severed the tie between the 2 nations. The sword eventually lowered, but it was Minister Shin, arriving with smooth apologies, who saved Minister Li's life in the end, a favour Minister Li neither wanted nor forgave. Hassan returned just in time to face the envoy in person. He showed up late, carrying the pelt of a tiger he claimed to have hunted himself for the banquet, and charmed the outraged Ming diplomat by pointing out that the pelt was missing its tail, which made it rarer. Eunuch Joe nearly choked hiding his laughter, because Eunuch Joe knew exactly what had happened to that tail. Hassan had cut a strip from the tiger skin hanging in the king's own chambers to fool the hunting dogs months ago. The envoy, however, had not come only for pelts. He had come to demand that Minister Shin be restored to his old position. It was an order carrying the weight of the Ming Emperor himself. Sun, his face carefully composed, agreed. Minister Li, standing beside him, gave no sign of what he was feeling, though both of them understood that they had just lost a very hard-won battle. It was not the only pressure Ming was going to apply. The envoy also carried a demand that Joseon send soldiers to fight alongside Ming against the rising Asen Gurun to the north. If Hassan refused, Ming might invade. If he accepted, Asen Gurun would become their enemy for generations. Minister Li quietly took the measure of the moment and told Hassan the truth. "From now on," he said, "the 2 of us are going to walk on a tightrope." Hassan's answer in court was strategic rather than defiant. He refused to send soldiers immediately. He leaned on the weight of his own exhaustion and his people's starvation. And then, in one of his characteristic moments, he turned the fury of Minister Shin's war faction back on them. "If you want so badly to die for a foreign empire," he told them, "go. Go yourselves. I will not send my people's sons to their deaths for your pride." Minister Shin went silent. The court went silent. Minister Li, behind the throne, allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Later, privately, Minister Li took another step. He drafted a secret letter to the Yurchin General Nurhachi, explaining that Joseon would not send troops against him and asking for peace. He asked Hassan to stamp it with the royal seal. Hassan hesitated. A seal used without thought could end a life or a nation. Minister Li told him, quietly, that he was the only person in the kingdom who could stamp it, and so he did. Outside the palace, the Queen Dowager was playing her own long game. She invited So-woon and Hassan to tea. Behind her innocent welcome, she was quietly pouring a tea made from dried flowers. A tea she had been feeding So-woon for months under the guise of the Royal Infirmary's gentle prescription. She'd arranged a tea that caused infertility. She did not know that Hassan was already watching her, but he was. A few days later, the royal physician, by chance or by fate, examined the flower leaves. Her face went grey. So-woon, once she understood, broke down and begged her not to tell the king. She didn't want him distracted, she said. She did not want him to carry this. Hassan, of course, found out anyway. He found her crying. He held her. He promised her, his voice low and furious, that he would find whoever had done this and make them pay. He went to the physician. He got the name. He walked straight to the Queen Dowager's courtyard, threw the box of flower tea at her feet, and demanded to know how a human being could do such a thing. The Queen Dowager did not flinch. She told him to depose the Queen for failing to bear an heir. Hassan screamed that he would depose her first. Minister Li came running and begged him to stop, because the moment those words left his mouth in front of the wrong ears, the court would tear the palace apart. The Queen Dowager, watching Hassan's rage with a small triumphant smile, said exactly what she'd been waiting to say. Go ahead, try. And walked away, victorious. In his chambers, Minister Li was unsparing. You knew she was baiting you, he told Hassan. Deposing a Queen Dowager is not something one king does on one bad morning. We need evidence, witnesses. The court must call for it. Hassan, shaking, agreed to wait. The plan was now clear. First they would bring Minister Yu, So Woon's exiled father, back to the palace and restore his position. With that foundation strengthened, Hassan's power would be solid enough to move against the Queen Dowager directly. Minister Li set out at once to fetch Minister Yu home. He arrived at the small mountain hut as evening was falling. He pushed open the door. Minister Yu was on the floor. A knife was in his heart. And very far away, in a small village the Queen Dowager's servants had already visited, a door that should have been standing closed was standing quietly open. The news broke on the palace like cold water. So Woon, who had just buried her grief for her own fertility, was told her father was dead. Her son had to catch her as she folded. Minister Li delivered the words with a voice that kept trying to crack. They all knew, without saying it, who was behind it. The Queen Dowager, through Prince Jin Pyong, who had argued so hard against Minister Yu's return. Minister Li warned Hassan not to arrest the prince without firm evidence, but Mu Young was dispatched quietly to search his home. Nothing incriminating was there, and so Minister Li, tired and bloody-handed in ways Hassan still did not fully understand, told Mu Young to take a fragment of one of the assassin's arrows with him. If there was no evidence to find, they would make some. It was not the kind of thing the Minister Li Hassan had first met would have done, but Minister Li was no longer that man. Prince Jin Pyong, catching wind of the trap, grabbed a sword, took the Minister of War hostage, and fought his way out of the palace. He escaped into the countryside with his own private army, some 3,000 mercenaries quietly assembled over months with silver provided by Minister Shin, and the palace was, suddenly, on the edge of war from within. Minister Shin, meanwhile, was playing a longer and more poisonous game. He had sent his man to find Dallei, and now a small piece of the past came back to strike. Long ago, when Dallei had cut the real king free from the monk's hut, Yi Heion had left behind a small ornate dagger, an heirloom dagger marked with a dragon, given to him by his father when he was made crown prince. Dallei had taken it with her. Gap Su, protecting her in the marketplace, had tried to kill Yi Jaeon with an ordinary knife and been arrested, and in the scuffle, Minister Shin's man had scooped up the dragon dagger. Minister Shin brought it to Hassan in his private chambers and said, "With great care, Your Majesty, is this the dagger the Ming Emperor once gave you?" Hassan, who had never seen it before, said yes. Minister Shin smiled slowly. Because the dagger had not come from Ming. It had been the last gift of a fleeing father to his young crown prince. Only the real Yi Heion would have known that. And now, Minister Shin knew, for certain, that the king was a fraud. He demanded Hasun reveal himself. He told him Dallei was in his hands. He threatened her life, and Hasun, sick with fear, pulled open a drawer and quietly took out 2 coins. He threw them at Minister Shin's feet. The 2 yang, the price of his sister. "I am the one you paid 2 yang," he said. Minister Shin laughed like a man who had already won. But he had not yet. At the interrogation, which Hasun was pressured to convene at once, Minister Shin swept in expecting to dismantle a clown and a reformer in a single afternoon. He brought Dallei in as his living proof. And Hasun, white-knuckled, played the king one more time. He named the criminal of the day, and the name was Shin Chi-su, Minister Shin's own name. The court lurched. Minister Shin bellowed that the impostor must not be allowed to fool them. Dallei was pushed forward to confirm that the man on the throne was her brother. Dallei looked at Hasun. She looked at him for a long time. And then she said, very clearly, "My brother died a long time ago." The court went silent. Minister Shin kept shouting. Hasun had Dallei escorted gently out, and then, with Minister Lee beside him, produced the true surprise of the day, Court Lady Kim, alive. Minister Lee had not lost her after all. Mu Young had been tracking Minister Shin's servant, had found her imprisoned in his house, and had brought her to safety. She testified, in open court, to everything. The posters, the murdered court painter, the drugging of the king, the poisoning of Huadang, the planting of straw dolls to frame the queen, all at Minister Shin's orders. Minister Shin was stripped, bound, and put to torture. He did not confess. Hasun watched anyway. The last piece was Yijium, the man who had ruined Dallei and set half of Hasun's grief in motion. Because Dallei was only a commoner, the old laws said what he had done to her carried no death sentence. Hasun, white with fury, announced that he would make a new law, and that for this crime, Yijium would be branded on his face. Yijium screamed for mercy. Hasun did not look away. Minister Lee watched Hasun watching the branding, and for the first time, he looked worried in a new way. Not worried that Hasun was weak, worried that he had been very, very deeply changed. Afterward, Hasun went to see Gapsu in the cells. Gapsu, who had tried to kill Yijium himself, wept openly when he recognized the king as his boy. Hasun arranged for him to be sent south to serve in the navy in Wanhyun, the town where he and Dallei had been children together. Dallei would join him soon, he promised, and this time he meant it. His sister came to his rooms to say goodbye. She was still small and scared, and she did not want to leave without him. He held her and apologized for every promise he had ever not kept. He told her he would come to her as soon as he could. And that evening, he stood alone in the snow-blue light of the palace gates and watched them go. So Woon found him there. She didn't ask him anything. She simply stood beside him and told him that one day, when all of this was over, they could visit Gapsu and Dallei together. She said she'd like to meet his family. Hasun looked at her for a long time, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not feel completely alone. The small comfort did not last long. The Queen Dowager, who had been waiting for her moment, struck. Before Minister Yu could be properly buried, before the court could even catch its breath, Hasun began a long, quiet campaign to move against her. Minister Lee arranged it carefully. They needed her to confess. They needed her to incriminate herself in front of the right witness. The bait was old grief. Minister Li visited her alone and spoke with unsettling gentleness about the anniversary of the little Prince Yule's death, about how the child had enjoyed his last meal, not knowing it was poisoned. The Queen Dowager's face changed. All at once, she understood who had carried out that long-ago order. Minister Li himself. She flung her teacup and screamed that she should have poisoned him, not Yi Heon. She admitted, in one long, bitter tirade, to ordering Prince Jin Pyung to kill the king, to kill the queen, to kill Minister Yu, all of it, because they had taken her son from her and she had taken her son's vengeance for herself. Minister Li stood up. Ha Sun, who had been listening from the next room, stepped inside. She'd confessed to the only man in the kingdom whose word could end her. Outside, walking away, Hassan asked Minister Li a question he had been holding for a long time. If you killed Prince Yule for the king, then who did you kill for me? Minister Li stopped. He had admitted, tried to resign in advance of this conversation. He told Hassan that yes, he had killed the king, that yes, he had forged evidence against Prince Jin Pyung. He offered, formally, to be turned over to punishment. Hasun took the letter of resignation and tore it up. You were trying to carry the weight alone, he said. That is why Minister Shin thought you were playing king. You should not have tried. He told Minister Li, plainly, that he was not afraid of him. He trusted him. He needed him. He asked him to protect the nation at his side. Minister Li, who had carried the deaths of a little prince and a grown king on his shoulders for years without speaking of either, knelt. He bowed, formally, to Ha Sun. I will no longer be afraid, he said. As your loyal servant, I will serve you. Hassan bowed back. The petition to depose the Queen Dowager went forward, so Woon visited her one last time. She offered her a way out, resign, go quietly to a temple, accept your fate. The Queen Dowager called her a lowly clown's woman, refused to beg forgiveness, and said she preferred to be deposed than to bend. She walked out of the palace on her own feet. And Harsun's throne, for the first time, truly felt like his own. Minister Li, his weight a little lighter now, asked permission to leave the capital and go to the border. The war between Ming and Isengurun was coming. The borders had to be held. He would take Woon Shim with him, he said, a promise decades overdue. That night, drunk and half asleep with his head in her lap at the house of entertainment, he finally told Woon Shim what he had never been able to tell her when they were young, that he had always regretted turning her away, and that he hoped they still had a chance. She cried. He cried. The plan was made. But the trap, of course, was already springing. Minister Shin, still in prison, still dangerous, had managed to intercept the secret peace letter to General Nahachi before Minister Li's courier reached the border. He had hidden it in his own house. His niece Hua Dang had found it, and under cover of night, with a handful of bribed guards and a decisive strike against the prison's loyalty, he was about to break free. At the palace, Hassan did not yet know any of this. He sat reading late, the quiet of the room wrapping around him, while somewhere in the city the letter that bore his royal seal moved into the wrong hands. The first Hasun knew of it was a messenger bursting in while he was reading stories with So Woon. Prince Jin Pyung had marched into the capital with his private army. The palace gates were slamming shut. Minister Li was out in the city and unreachable. Minister Shin was free. The letter, the sealed letter Hasun had once stamped on Minister Li's word, was now in Minister Shin's hands, and with it, Anyone could argue that the king had secretly betrayed Ming. Anyone could call for his deposition. Anyone could turn the royal seal against the throne. Mu Young moved fast. He sent word to General Kang on the frontier. So Woon, thinking fast, sent her own message to General Kim, an old friend of her late father's. Both generals were days away. The palace had to hold for 4 days on skeleton staff. Eunuch Zhou offered to arm the eunuchs, so Woon took charge of the kitchens, and Ha Sun, for the first time since he had been made king, realised that every promise he had ever made to his people was about to be tested at once. Prince Jinpyong marched to the West Palace, where the deposed Queen Dowager still lived, to present her with a gift. Minister Shin brought Minister Li in on his knees. The Queen Dowager was delighted. Here was the man who had killed her son, kneeling at her feet. Minister Li, beaten and bound, looked up at her and laughed. He laughed so well and so long that he turned the whole scene sideways. He told her that even if she wanted the king gone, deposing him without cause was treason and that she was about to self-destruct. He mocked Prince Jinpyong as a worm pretending to be a dragon. He baited them over and over into trying to kill him on the spot, because if they did, her son would never relent, and the entire coup would die in that courtyard with him. The Queen Dowager, slower than her pride, understood the bait in time. She kept him alive. She ordered him held for later. At the palace, the first letter from Minister Shin arrived. If Hasun would open the gates, hand over the royal seal, and allow Minister Li to be beheaded, the rebellion would end. Ho Gale, who had ridden in with the message and who had been crying ever since, fell to the ground and begged Hassan to save Minister Li any way he could. So Woon found Hassan alone afterward and asked him, in her gentle way, which he would save, his child or his loyal servant. He said he would not give up either. She knew it already. She told him he would find a way. She had watched him do it before. Hassan called for an assembly. He invited Prince Jinpyong and Minister Shin back into the palace, under guard, with only 10 soldiers apiece. He promised Minister Li would be there. The 2 rebels hesitated. They agreed, because the letter was in the palace, and they needed the palace open to retrieve it. Concubine Huadang, meanwhile, had made a decision of her own. She had taken the letter from her uncle, as he told her to, but then she came to Hassan quietly and confessed that she had it. She had not forgiven her uncle for poisoning her. Son, surprised and moved, asked her to bring the letter at once. She never made it back. She was murdered in her rooms before morning. Her court lady, brought by Minister Shin, had killed her and hidden the letter. By the time Mu Young found the body, the letter was gone. Before the assembly, Hassan went to see the Queen Dowager one more time. She tried, one last time, to make him kneel. She reminded him, with knife-edge politeness, that she could still expose his identity to the world. She threatened, in particular, to brand the Queen an adulteress for having loved a clown. Hassan did not kneel. He stood over her and told her, very quietly, that if she made So Woon cry even once more, he would make her pay for every tear. He told her she did not know what was truly valuable, that the heavens decided a man's worth by what was in his heart, not his blood, that her only pride was her blood. And he walked out. The assembly began. Minister Li, unbound at Hassan's insistence, knelt in the courtyard. He looked up at the throne with a calm her son had never seen on him before. Before the testimony began, Minister Li asked permission to speak to the king alone for a moment, Prince Jinpyong and Minister Shin came with him into Hasun's chambers and let him do it, because his hands were bound, and what could a bound man do? Minister Li looked at Hasun for a long time, and then he said, gently, "Your Majesty, remember the two ways to survive in the palace. Crush your enemies, or ignore them. Today, ignore. Make the nation your priority. Discard everything else, even me." Hasun said that would be like the man in the story abandoning his loyal servant. Minister Li, who understood the comparison all the way down, said he was honoured to be compared to such a man. Their eyes met. Everything they could not say to each other out loud passed between them anyway. "Your Majesty," Minister Li said quietly, "I was honoured to serve you. I have no regrets." Her son insisted he would live many more years. Minister Li only smiled. "That," he said, "is what I wanted to say to you. For this nation and its people, you must stay strong. Years to come, protect the throne." They were taken back out to the courtyard. Minister Shin read the letter aloud. Prince Jinpyong demanded Minister Li's confession. Minister Li said plainly that he was not ashamed, that making peace with a neighbour was not a crime. Minister Shin turned on Hasun. "Did you know of this letter?" he asked. "If you did, it is treason. If you did not, then your chief royal secretary used your seal without permission, which is death." Hasun could not read the letter. He had trusted Minister Li when he had stamped it. He opened his mouth to say so. Minister Li spoke first. "I used the royal seal without permission." Hasun begged him, wordless, not to do it. Minister Li stood. In one fluid motion he seized a sword from a nearby guard, turned and drove it through Prince Jinpyong's body. One of the guards slashed his back. He kept his footing. He ran the prince through. He fell to his knees. He looked up at Hasun once. Hasun screamed his name. His name was Haksan. The palace closed its gates around Hasun's grief. He cradled Minister Li's head as the older man asked, almost lightly, that his body be hung above the castle gates as evidence that the traitor had been dealt with. Hasun refused to disrespect him that way. Minister Li told him he was glad, just once, to hear Hasun call him loyal servant, and then he was gone. Hasun sent a message to the deposed Queen Dowager. "Pause your soldiers for one day so I can mourn my servant properly," he said, "or I will hang his body at the gates for the nation to see and let them know exactly who started this rebellion." She agreed, because she had no other choice. Minister Li's body was carried out through the rebel lines by Hogyeol, who wept the whole way, Woon Shim, who had finally been promised a life by his side, knelt by his casket and mourned the future they had not been given. Hasun let Minister Shin and the bleeding Prince Jinpyong leave the palace with their lives, temporarily. The Queen Dowager, back in her stronghold, planned the final blow. She had Minister Shin lead his soldiers to the palace that very night, because she was certain Hasun's reinforcements had not arrived. But Hasun had been taught carefully and painfully by the man whose blood was still drying on the courtyard stones. When Minister Shin arrived, the palace gate stood open. The courtyard was empty, and when he sent his soldiers in, the gate slammed shut behind them, cutting him off alone with the king. Hasun stepped out of the shadows. He told Minister Shin plainly what he was being killed for stealing the letter, for endangering the border, for raising a sword against the nation, for Minister Li. Minister Shin tried, even then, to bargain. He offered the Queen Dowager's head. Hasun drove the sword into his belly, yanked it free, and cut his throat. General Kim's army had arrived at last. The rebellion broke. Prince Jinpyong died alone in his room. Reaching for a water jug he could no longer lift, and when the Queen Dowager, still trying to win, demanded the throne room the next morning, she walked into a trap Hassan had prepared with the help of Lord Yonghua, her own first choice of replacement king. The full court witnessed her official deposition. Her crimes were read out, the curses, the flower tea, the ordering of Lord Yu's murder, the instigation of the rebellion. She was ordered to drink poison. She refused escort. She walked to the courtyard under her own power. She drank her own death and kept her pride intact the entire way. It was the one thing she had ever truly possessed. Afterward, Hassan sat very still in his own chambers, and Sawun came and sat beside him and simply took his hand. He told her it was the first time he'd ever taken a life. He told her he had no regrets. He told her he would do worse, if he had to protect the nation. And he promised her, and himself, that he would never become an animal who used power for his own pleasure. The country, slowly, began to breathe. The rice payment law went into effect in the southern provinces. Ho-geol went to Jeju to see how the people were receiving it, an assignment he grumpily tried to turn into a vacation. The physicians compiling the great medical compendium were commissioned to translate it into the common script, so that ordinary people could read it. Hassan worked late, sleeping less than he should, and Sowun began finding him asleep in the library more often than not. One day, on a small trip out of the palace, a young nobleman named Lord Giseong said something to Hassun as they watched peasants working in a field. "The job of a king," he said, "is not to wield power as he pleases. It is to approve what the court discusses and take responsibility for the consequences." Hassan looked at him for a long moment and said nothing. But he remembered. Months later, his ministers pressed him gently. "You have created peace. It is time to produce an heir." Even Sowun believed, quietly, that he should bring in a concubine. Hassan sat her down and told her the truth he'd been carrying for a while. He didn't intend to father an heir of his blood. He intended to abdicate. He'd been watching the officials for a successor and had chosen Lord Giseong, because Lord Giseong understood that the throne was not his to own. Hassun had been, from the beginning, only borrowing it. He had never believed otherwise. Sowun heard him out, and then, with a calmness he half expected and still loved her for, she asked only that he absolve her of her own title first, so that she could leave the palace as a commoner and wait for him outside it. No Queen Dowager, no palace walls, just a small life and the man who had cracked hazelnuts on a wishing bridge with her. Her son stamped his abdication with a royal seal. He crowned Lord Giseong. He packed the brush pouch she had embroidered for him, and the small red compass she had bought him in the market. Eunuch Joe, who had been Hassan's teacher, his grumpy conscience, and very occasionally his partner in stolen snacks, asked to come with him. Hassan gently refused. He had recommended him for promotion. The new king would need Eunuch Joe the way he himself once had. Eunuch Joe gave him a drawing he'd made, based on Hassan's name, which meant summer fairy, and said that serving him had been the blessing of a lifetime. They held each other and cried. Hassan walked out of the throne room. At the edge of the brick path, he stopped for a breath, and then stepped off it. A commoner again, for the first time in years. He looked lighter than anyone had ever seen him. Mu Young caught up to him on the road. Hassan laughed. "So you really have fallen for me," and welcomed him gladly. And then, without warning, assassins came out of the trees. Whose assassins? Hassan would never know. Some final loyalist of the Queen Dowager's, perhaps. Some remnant of Minister Shin's reach. The world had a long memory for men who had undone it. Mu Young fought them as he had always promised he would. 2 arrows struck Har-sun in the back. A sword ran through Mu Young's chest. Mu Young, before he fell, killed the last of them, and then stepped between the last blade and Har-sun one final time. Har-sun collapsed. Mu Young collapsed beside him. In his last moment he remembered the wish he had written on a kite at the festival long ago, to serve my king, and die in the line of duty. He got exactly what he had asked for. 2 years passed. Gap-Su and Dal-Lei were with their old troupe again. They had a new story they performed in village squares, about a king as wise as he was handsome, whose greatest talent had been looking out for his people. Dal-Lei was tiny and strong and speaking freely now. Gap-Su, full of joy, introduced the king, a red-robed figure who danced and spun and leapt into the air to throw off his mask. So Woon, a commoner now, arrived quietly at one of their performances. She stood at the back and listened. When it was over, she pressed 2 jade rings into Dal-Lei's hand, a gift too fine for a street donation. Dal-Lei tried to refuse, so Woon told her that she had enjoyed hearing about someone she admired. Neither of them knew who the other was, and yet Woon Shim, in the capital, finally packed away the things Minister Lee had left in her care. She cried once more, quietly and without apology, and then walked out of the house of entertainment for good. She decided to travel, she told Ho-Jil. She wanted to live, for a little while, simply because living was still possible. So, Woon kept the little red compass always with her. She remembered the day 2 of Har-sun's guards had come to her with it. They had found it beside Mu Young's body. Of Har-sun himself, there had been no trace. The guards had called him dead. So Woon had refused to believe them. If there was no body, she had told them, there was still a chance. She had lived these 2 years on that chance. One morning she walked out of a village into a field. She carried a single hazelnut. She cracked it. She closed her eyes. She made her wish. She opened her eyes, and she was alone. She turned to walk back, and he was there. Har-sun, thinner, older, alive. For a long time she simply looked at him, afraid that if she moved, he would disappear the way he always did in her dreams. She promised him, softly, that she would stay where she was if he would only stay where he was. He told her, his voice shaking, that it had not been a dream, that he had walked a very long way through a very long sleep to find her, that he was sorry he had not been faster. She did not wait any longer after that. She threw her arms around his neck. They wept, and then they stopped weeping. He took her hand, and together, the 2 of them walked home. History, in the end, remembered the rain only in fragments. The records say that in a certain year, a king suppressed a great rebellion and governed the nation wisely, and that the people praised his virtue. The records say that he later deposed his queen and abdicated his throne, and that shortly afterward he passed away. The records, as records do, left out almost everything that mattered. There were rumours, of course. Whispers that a clown with the king's face had walked the palace halls. Whispers that the queen had loved someone who was not her husband. Whispers that a loyal secretary had killed the man he served in order to save the country the man could no longer govern. None of these rumours were ever confirmed. Perhaps none of them needed to be. That is where the story leaves them, in a quiet field, in ordinary clothes, under an ordinary sky, walking away from the only kind of power worth having, which is the kind one is willing, in the end, to give back.